I think if it's okay, I'll just sit here and talk to the stage. So first of all, let me thank the organizers for having this very important discussion, the ISD and Dr. Scantor in particular. A very important topic, and it's great to see so much attention being paid to the issue and sort of heavyweight speakers. So I am delighted to be here. I know we possibly have more people coming, so I will move along as quickly as I can. It's a bit daunting to follow such a raft of such distinguished economists, Igomari and Chris and Paari, in particular on a topic that they all know so well. And unlike Minister Lomwang, I lack his storytelling talent, so I'm in a bit of a bind. So my plan here is to talk a little bit on the micro side of what is of course a macro topic, and talk a little bit about the issue of services and service sector from the investor perspective and to some degree from the sector perspective, just to add a little color on sort of what these issues look like on the ground. Let's see if I can do the 1, 2. So before I get to the macro, let me just begin with a little of the macro story as well. A lot of this ground has already been covered, but worth reminding and making the point that services is an extremely important topic economically and a sector that should be growing over time as Indonesia grows and moves up the value chain. And yet, as all the speakers have made the point, the sector is lagging behind its regional and to a certain extent its global peers. Its share of the overall economy has held reasonably steady for the last several decades. We are running a deficit in services, as Igomari pointed out. And again, at the sectoral level, you could sort of pick any one of them and look at the sectoral deficit. Igomari pointed to health as an example, and the latest numbers from the health ministry is that Indonesia is running a health sector deficit of perhaps $1.5 billion. I suspect from sort of looking at some of the Singaporean trade statistics that actually that number might be quite a bit higher on the health side, and as well from looking at it from the Malaysian side as well. So it's one example where we can look at it as a missed opportunity, but we can also look at it as a tremendous opportunity for Indonesia with the right amount of policy change. Again, I won't spend too much time on this because the point has been made, but again, as we look at the service sector, regardless of how we define it, there's some wiggle room on the data, but regardless of how we define it, Indonesia is consistently sort of at the low end of its regional peer group in terms of services. And again, you can look at that as a missed opportunity or as an opportunity going forward, but it does point out that quite clearly an area of need of policy reform attention from the government. So let me talk a little bit about yours truly. Thank you. Subcontract that out. More productive immediately. So again, I won't read every word. We thought we would just take up a couple of categories from trade restrictions, infrastructure, institutional, and more just pure policy. Just to give a few examples, we talk a lot about policy restrictions. Why is it that we are not as productive as competitive in a variety of services? And there is no one answer. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and so this is not an exhaustive list, I should add. But if you look at just straight trade, if we look at the customs area, for example, there are for anybody who's in the importing or exporting business, quite a mountain of paperwork to get through, and even that we are moving towards an e-filing system, it currently is sort of a combination of it, or it's an additive requirement because it hasn't really reduced the paper requirements in customs forms. If we look at infrastructure, again, it's not really particularly about infrastructure today, but the point is that if, particularly for the logistics sector, infrastructure is a critical driver of competitiveness, and for the last decade, Indonesia has spent roughly half relative to GDP on infrastructure, as it did, say, in the 1990s. And as a result, if we look at kind of an infrastructure readiness or an infrastructure index, Indonesia has dropped considerably down that scale. Institutional, we have a number of speakers have made the point on, I think Chris in particular pointing to the rule of law, rule of contract security as a critical enabler for more rapid services growth. That certainly is a point that's upheld in a number of the conversations that we have with businesses across many sectors. The relatively poor coordination across different ministries is another point worth raising. If you sort of took a cherry-picking approach and you looked at any one regulation, you can often find a regulation that you like. The challenge for investors is that if you look a little harder, there's often a regulation that you don't like. And it's not always so clear. In fact, it's usually unclear which one is going to be more pertinent to you when it comes to implementation. So getting clarity and a coordination, the coordinating role in policy is absolutely critical. In terms of in the last column, I would just highlight that investments that are prohibiting private investment, but foreign investment also in a number of sectors, again, particularly in the infrastructure and logistics sector, are highlighted by a number of industries and a number of surveys and economic analysis, including the ones we've had this morning, as an important factor of holding back productivity in particular sectors. Next page, please. On the upside, as Minister Lembong talked about this morning, the current government is quite forthrightly and explicitly and intently addressing some of these issues. So I'm still using the old number of 11 packages. I heard this morning we're up to 12, so I may have missed one. But since September, the government has been quite regularly putting forward, in recognition that over the previous decade, there has been a raft of regulation and policies that have been restricting competition and productivity to gradually unpack this and taking that away. Very, very well received by the investment community. I think there is still considerable, doubt is probably too strong a word, but considerable interest in waiting to see what the implementation schedule is for these committed deregulation policies. And it's a lot of work, and some of them require new laws or changes to laws. Many of them require ministerial regulations. So nobody's suggesting it's an easy process, and the government has given itself a lot of homework because there's a lot of material in these 11 or 12 packages to date. Nevertheless, having something like an implementation scorecard would be helpful to sort of enhance investor confidence that the government is putting equal focus into the implementation side as to the policy, the strategy, if you will, of policy reform. Partly, it would be probably fair to point out that in previous efforts at policy reform or deregulation, such as the one that we had in 2013, there was in fact a lot of that promised reform that in the end did not happen, or did not happen to the extent or the quickness with which the government said it would. And that, it wasn't that long ago, has conditioned the investment the investor community to look quite closely at implementation in addition to the commitments on reform. So let me, a couple of suggestions flowing from that. Just some ideas to consider that have come up in a number of conversations with different investor groups. One of them is, let me just continue to tell by P, let me know how we think of it. Basically, there's a lot of input between the private sector and the government. I think it's generally thought that there's a lot of upside, a lot of potential for making that more structured in terms of having a more structured, formal role, for example, for CADI and APEM, other business groups to meet with the cabinet or subsectors of the cabinet to be able to provide in a more real and predictable time input from the business community. Efforts like today by the government, by Minister Lundblom's comments this morning, for example, to have the government formally articulate its support to strengthen the services sector, to incorporate service sector commitments into the set of free trade agreements that are currently being negotiated with Australia, Europe, the TIFA talks with the United States, potentially in the TPP talks going forward, and to much like as Barry had sort of described, the mindset shift in Garuda looking at passengers to customers, how the government over time makes a mindset shift from being a regulator to a facilitator in the services sector would go a long way to bringing harmony and consistency to the reform packages under next chart, please. Just a quote by President Aquino, who was the chair of the APEC summit last year, and there was a particular effort into the services sector. As he points out, and the Philippines is moving it quite rapidly on, the services account for 2/3 of the GDP in the APEC region. From an ASEAN point of view, it's critical that ASEAN make sure that it moves in that direction, as opposed, which will require a faster rate of growth. I am mindful of both time and other speakers, so I had 2 or 3 case studies that I wanted to go through. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and perhaps when we come back a little later, we can discuss that more. So the 3 case studies, the first one is around distribution and logistics. Obviously, it's a key area for, or a key driver for competitiveness, getting essentially the task of getting goods from factory to customer, down the highways, through customs, through ports, through airports, and to the customer. And in general, as we all know, Indonesia's logistics sector is less competitive than many of its peer countries around the region. At 24% of GDP, logistics costs are high, and much of this is policy induced. There are regulations, there are outdated customs procedure. There's been relatively little progress in making the national single window implemented in practice. We have restrictions, and we have new regulations that threaten actually to take us in the wrong direction in terms of freight forwarding. Some of the new rules coming out in customs, costs are going up at airport cargo screening. So we talk about logistics and we talk about reform. The reality is there is still quite a lot of regulation coming out that industry is looking quite closely at to measure the government's success in improving logistics costs. Next slide. Financial services, again, it's an area that is very, very important to improving our service level productivity. It's still a very highly concentrated sector. It's still a lot of scope left for more deepening in terms of what insurance companies can do, other institutional investors. There is, again, though, a variety of regulations, some recently implemented, some in the process of being discussed, that would add other costs to providers. in terms of e-money licenses. As you all know, e-commerce, which I'll talk about in a second, has got great potential in Indonesia, and still 80% of e-commerce transactions are cash on delivery. So there's one can look at that stat and say that's time consuming and not so productive. It creates a huge opportunity if policies and regulations can be supportive of investment in that area as opposed to protective and restrictive. And finally, final case study around ICT and e-commerce, which I just started talking about. There is, again, a huge opportunity for Indonesia. There's no reason why Indonesia should not already be, but can be in the future the largest e-commerce market in ASEAN and one of the largest in Asia. What we do have, though, is a number of rules that limit investments in this area. We have relatively low broadband penetration, which of course is more of a hardware constraint. But I would focus on, because that's the theme of today, is really more the policy menu in this issue. And so whether it's local content rules in the telco space, whether of course our current conversations around OTT, over-the-top services. Now there are very legitimate public policy issues around these sorts of companies from a taxation point of view, from a legal point of view. But I would end with the point that these disruptive technologies, as Ibamari was talking about earlier, provide a huge amount of value. It's difficult to quantify that value. But one thing that's not so hard to quantify is the consumer demand for them. So when we look at Indonesia as the largest or the third largest Facebook market, or the amount of Twitter users, we see that there's an enormous demand. The social media provides a function. I take Bari's point of it, that is a good deal of that is around gossip, but it's not just that. There are people using Facebook ads, Google ads to do business in a cheaper way. As we looked at the recent controversy around Uber and Gojek, and no doubt there will be future controversies about that. There's no doubt that these sort of services are meeting an unmet consumer demand. Everything has to be regulated properly, but I guess the point that I'm trying to get to here is that the task for regulators is to be thoughtful and careful to balance and make the right trade-offs between how we think about consumers and how we think about producers. And a lot of, in the end of the day, what provides service level productivity and service level competitiveness, just like the 99 design examples that Ibamari talked about, is letting consumers find their way and using technology and using services. The consumers are often quite clever about what adds value and what doesn't. And it's a point that oftentimes gets missed in the policy-making discussion, that sometimes can overly focus on the producer side of the equation. So as we see across these different sectors, there is a huge amount of opportunity from the policy side to unlock growth and unlock the potential of the services sector. And of course, it's very encouraging to see that the government is actually spending an increasing amount of time thinking about that and starting to act on it.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting.